Okay, so here is a little lecture on composition and some traditional typographic styles that have developed throughout time. So as you see here, I did this by hand because I figured that it would be the easiest way for me to do it, to explain it to you all. Again, a lot of typography and a lot of graphic design is still handmade. So, work with your hands. Don't always count on the computer to make things for you. So here's what I'm calling traditional composition. So we start with the golden circle, the Fibonacci sequence, classical proportions, one column of type, right? So the golden circle proportions are 1 to 1 to 2 to 3. It works very well if you're in a book setting, right? So for example, the Gutenberg Bible is an example of that proportion, right? And then you can start to see further examples of it throughout time where those proportions are deemed to be sort of the aesthetically acceptable proportions for design and typography. Keep in mind, remember, typography was done by hand on a letterpress before, like after Gutenberg. Before that was all handmade, usually by monks. There was calligraphy. And keep in mind, here, the hierarchy starts with this very, very flowery, decorative initial cap. You're using color. Here's another sort of smaller initial cap that sort of helps you that guides your eye towards where to read. Notice here all of the cue, how decorative it is. This is a serif. Remember, sans serifs don't come in until much later on, right? So we are, in that sort of sense, the golden circle. Here's sort of an ideation of the golden circle. Usually ends up looking like this sort of seashell shape, right? In terms of organizing, we also can use the rules of thirds, which has been very popular with photographers. So for example, if you have a page, you divide it into 3 columns, and the tension point is where those lines meet. Usually the center tends to be the least interesting place to put anything. Usually where lines meet, that's where the interest lies, the tension. As we continued on, one of the things I want to say, for example, here's the Declaration of Independence in the US, right? It's one big column of type. This was the initial first version, what I call the press release version, right? Printed by John Dunlap in Philadelphia. Notice it's a really long, wide column. Okay, like this is really long, probably has more than 60 to 70 characters per line. The initial cap sort of sets you off where you need to start to read. Notice how it still uses, for example, the all uppercase versus the small case here. This is all set by hand on the letterpress. About 20 years later, Mary Catherine Goddard prints a 2-column version in which she pushes sort of typographic convention further, right? So it's 2 columns, it's easier to read. This becomes more decorative, more typographically exciting. It's not just one big column. Remember, this was being posted on corners in a new country in America in 1776. So as we move further away, we start the rumblings of, for example, here's some data where things get more expressive, right? Remember, right now we're working denotatively, right? So it's all horizontal type. We're just trying to very clearly present to the reader what the information is about. We start hearing data. Then we get to futurism, Marinetti. This really gets expressive, right? Marinetti is a poet trying to figure out a new way to talk about, to engage with typography, right? So it gets really, really expressive. So we are no longer necessarily staying in the traditional 1 column. We're pushing towards many columns. We get towards modernism, and in modernism, later on, the Bauhaus comes, and Dada and Futurism and several other movements converge into the Bauhaus, what we now know as the Bauhaus. And then out of the Bauhaus comes this, a little further past the Bauhaus, I'm sort of compressing a lot of time here, we get sort of grids. And this hits really big in Switzerland, in Europe. In America, we took over grids and we appropriated it. The business world took over it. It became standard format for everything, for graphic design, hidden architecture. So for example, here's Meester van der Rohe Seagram building in New York, right? It's a grid, right? It's even, proportions, everything is even all around. There's units, there's modules, right? Here is Joseph Mueller-Brockman's famous grid, which he used pretty much his entire life to generate a body of work. This was sort of the basis for it. He had variations of it. Notice that it's 4 columns, but also has these horizontal modules to help you organize, right? So Swiss style is very rational. It's about communicating a system. It's very mathematical. And it is about, a grid is about creating a system that if, for example, you're doing a book of 700 pages, you can get through. When you're doing single pages, you have more flexibility, right? So that this grid by Mueller-Brockman leads him to start doing works like this, right? Where hierarchy is really, really important. So for example, how does he achieve it here? The contrast of the color, the flood of color, there's a contrast here, then the type size goes to black, and then everything else below. So you have a hook, right? That shows you where your eye needs to go. Here, it's a record. You have a hook here, and then it takes you into anthology. Notice everything's moving around. It's a record. So notice how the lines of type are placed as if you were playing a record, right? In that sense. And another Mueller-Brockman example, notice he's using the same grid. Here, look at how he achieves, how he creates his really interesting composition. Notice it's not exactly in the halfway point, half lines in the middle, center is the least interesting place, but he has this big flood of blue and then this large type in white. So there's complete contrast here right away. And then from the hook, he sends you to this single little line here. Notice all this type is the same size, right? This single little line, and then that single little line leads you into the rest of the information in the composition, right? So keep in mind, we're talking about organizing information. How do we help readers read this information, right? What is the information saying? How do we get to a typographic composition that expresses what the information, what the content is really talking about, right? I wrote down here, which expresses the content best, right? How do you work? How do you like to work? Some people really love the rules of thirds. Some really love grids. Grids have become really, really, really important. So I'm going to emphasize that a lot. All of you get really comfortable using grids, right? Sometimes you only need one column if you're setting a novel. Sometimes you need many columns depending on how many different voices, how many different amounts of content, whether you have footnotes, whether you have indexical information. So start thinking about that. And in these posters, how much information is there? Is there one voice? Is there 2 voices? Is there, many different things happening within the narrative of the text? You can use your grid to show us that, right? So that is that one. And then I have, for example, here to start looking at composition. And this goes back to this handout, the principles of composition, which I have placed in the Google Drive that I set up, right? So for example, our natural inclination is to put things in the center, which is not always the most interesting thing. If you go to the rules of thirds, you start to see how you can start placing things here, but notice how we put everything sort of in one line in the middle, but start getting interesting tension and contrast by placing things around. Take the lines off and you start to see how these start to play. Then you can move on to creating a composition where you can start thinking about scale and space and direction and the form and see how this circle takes it fully. And if I were to fill this circle in black, for example, will it take the hierarchy? The eye just goes there and then you start guiding around, right? So start thinking of composition, things you can use: form, scale, the weight, how you use space, the direction, and the texture. And there's no examples of texture here, but start thinking about how those compositions really help you to tell the story of the narrative that you're trying to talk about. And with that, I'm going to do another little video to show you what your homework is next week, but I wanted to make sure that I can show to you individually so you understand what it is you're going to be making. And I will talk to you in a little bit.